So I also think that there is a tendency to pick bad open source projects. One of two things: the open source projects that classes tend to pick tend to be either very complex or they tend to be overly simple. And the problem with that is an overly simple project can't absorb the volunteers. They can't take on 30 people from a class or 10 people from a class and effectively work with them. While a giant project is going to have so much bureaucracy and overhead that it's going to take you the entire semester just to wade through that. There's also projects that are not welcoming to newcomers. The Linux kernel is a great example of this. If you haven't been rejected 5 times before you actually get accepted, then they've done something wrong. And Leslie made an excellent excellent point yesterday when she said, look at projects on OpenHatch and look at projects that are doing Google Summer of Code or Close Analog. Those are groups that have some infrastructure in place for dealing with students and are used to it. But you need to be very careful. And I talked about earlier that professors need to have participation. They need to be participating in these communities and communicating at least the expectation that, hey, there's going to be some students, and also know what the community is like. I talked about the portion of the class at USC that was doing technical writing. To tell you a little bit more about how I failed there, and I'm happy to tell people that I failed because it was my responsibility. Went and met with the class, met with the professor. I met with the students. We communicated via email. And the students would say, all right, we're going to do this. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm actually, how long did it take before they realized that they were in over their head?
2 months.
They only had 1 month left.
Yes, and quite frankly, we didn't realize, it did not dawn on us that, wow, 4 people who aren't intimately familiar with our project are not going to be able to assimilate all the knowledge they need of the project itself, much less the infrastructure. So to tell you more about that disaster, we write documentation in DocBook XML, which means that you're hand coding XML tags for your documentation. We're using version control. We had a very, at the time, complex publishing tool chain, which required some pretty nasty hacking to get PDFs and HTML formats outputted. It never dawned on us that someone would not want to tackle that, because typically if someone jumped in and said, I want to work on it, we'd say, great, here's the stuff, go make it happen. And nobody does that with a guide as large as the install guide initially, and typically they don't do it alone. And so these students decided they were going to do it. They said, we're going to go study how this is done. We're going to go through the installer. We'll read the existing documentation. And a rewrite should be simple, right? Editing 400 pages for changes in software is no problem. They went silent on me. There were no mailing list posts, no communication in IRC. I could get an email response from one person who said, we're still working. Part of open source, though, is that you're showing your incremental work, and that wasn't being done. We also had weekly meetings that they would not show up to. And we had a mailing list that was 20 or 30 messages a week that they were not participating on either. A month in, I finally convinced them that they really needed to introduce themselves to the community. Send an introduction email. And they did. And then I didn't hear from them again for another week. And I can't overstate this too much. You should expect that communication will consume 50% or more of the time of all the work that they're doing. Because unlike a class where you sit down with a person 1 hour every time, every session, the people in open source will see each other once a year, twice a year. To give you an idea, I haven't seen Leslie in 2 years. I haven't seen Ruth in 6 months. No, I guess I saw you in LA, didn't I? A month, okay. Ruth doesn't count. So you're going to go months without seeing people. And so you're going to have to carry on that communication because you can't do things in a vacuum. I could not let there not be an install guide for that release of Fedora. It had to get done. I had no idea what they had done. And they weren't telling us. So effectively, I started getting scared and saying, I need to start working in parallel. This is going very, very badly. In the end, about 2 months into the semester, they realized, wow, we need to be communicating. We see the problems. We don't even know the answers to some of our questions. And so they began communicating nightly with us for about the last month. And that meant that they were on IRC every single night for about 2 hours. It meant that they were actually doing their work in the open and committing that to a public repository. And in the end, I think it was a great learning experience for them. I think I frustrated the professor to death because I kept emailing the professor saying, I haven't heard from your students. I haven't heard from your students. Is work actually being done? And I think that her expectation was, because she was not involved with the community, I didn't demand that. I was thrilled that they were willing to experiment with us. Because quite honestly, this has been 2 or 3 years ago, we were still trying to figure out how to make this work and how to integrate with students. We didn't have people who were going full-time into bringing students in as part of their classwork. Google Summer of Code certainly existed, and they were doing wonderful things, but that was students who took their own initiative to get involved in open source. That wasn't professors directing traffic to open source. And I think higher education also sets students up for fail because with regards to open source, because they tell students you don't work with someone else to get work done. You don't share answers. You surely are not going to talk about how to solve it together. You're supposed to be doing your own work. That tends to change as people become in their 3rd and 4th year of college and also in grad school when people start collaborating. But they also have very different ideas about collaboration. You collaborate around a table with the 4 people in your work group. You're not collaborating with someone who doesn't speak your language natively. You're not collaborating with someone who's not in your time zone. Those are all very different problems. And then you get to the cultural issues because you have idiomatic expressions that someone else who's from India or someone who's from Europe is not going to understand. Particularly in the South, it's hard to imagine there are places that don't serve sweet tea. There are places that won't even understand some of the idiomatic expressions that we use all the time, and having to collaborate with them is how work happens even outside the open source world in real business, and there's not that understanding. And I think that's one of the things that open source solves. I think it teaches collaboration on that scale very well. But I think that we do a poor job, most of the implementations do a poor job of setting those expectations. So how do we fix it? I think that if you're going to be serious about having open source participation in your classwork, that it behooves you to be involved in at least one open source project and be involved in it for 6 months or more. I'd urge you to then make sure that that's one of the projects that you let your students work in, because you'll know the lay of the land. I don't think that's necessarily a panacea and will solve all your problems, but I think it is. I think if you want to fast track that, you should attend Posscon, which is the professor's open source software experience, which Red Hat puts on during the summer. They'll essentially put you in a room with some really smart people for a week plus and feed you lots of methamphetamine so that you can stay up all night and give you a crash course in how to participate. I think you should also not let students choose. I don't think you ought to let students choose the projects they're going to work on. You may give them a choice of a subset of projects, but if the guy thinks that he wants to work on a project and he thinks that something that hasn't been worked on in 2 years is the coolest thing and that's what excites him, that's going to be a frustrating experience for everyone. You should be choosing the projects they're going to work on, and you should also be working with those specific projects to identify tasks that students can complete. There's a great article written by Mike McGrath on what it takes to be a successful open source software contributor. And the number one thing is time. And when we tend to think of tasks like rewriting a web page, we tend to think of that as, oh, that's X number of hours worth of work. We dismiss that there are meetings to attend. There's information collection that has to occur. And then people are going to have to review it. And potentially there's additional infrastructure you have to interact with. Those tasks should really be well thought out. Not just, I'm not saying set up a fake set of tasks for people to do, but if you don't know all the steps involved in the tasks that your students are about to run down, there's going to end up being a problem. Because there's going to be some, oh yes, that only involves fixing a specific bug, but we require you to jump through X number of hoops to submit that work. Is going to end up coming back and biting you. I think the expectation should be set with students out front that they're going to have to read the mailing list every day. They're going to have to be on IRC every day they're doing work on the project. They're going to have to be blogging. They're going to have to be, before they even start, they're going to have to spend a week worth of time reading web pages to learn about the community. And that doesn't sound very fun. I think it's a vital learning experience, but I don't think we set those expectations with students.